it's quite a bit of work for us to go through all those applications, review the pitch decks, and make those selections. It's not uncommon that we'll see some problematic statistics in those pitch decks. And when that happens, it causes the entrepreneur to lose some credibility, and it can really turn a pitch deck into a quick no. We today have Jevin West with us, who is an Associate Dean for Research at the University of Washington. He's a co-founder for the Institute for an Informed Public and co-creator of a class at UW that's called Calling Bullshit. I've had the privilege of sitting in on several lectures of this class, and I've always found it highly informative as well as entertaining. Today, he's going to focus on some of the pitch decks, and we have shared with him confidentially some pitch decks that AOA has received. We've taken some real examples from those pitch decks, anonymized them, so that we can have this be really real and meaningful for people. And to be clear, our goal is absolutely not to mock the entrepreneurs who are trying to make the world a better place and doing their best to create a good pitch deck. Our goal is to provide some feedback to entrepreneurs of this type of statistics or these types of things can become problems. Whether it's a data fallacy or like a zombie statistic, you'll hear about those in this presentation. But at AOA, we really want to see better pitch decks with compelling business cases, verifiable statistics in them. And we also want to help the other angel investors understand how to process the data presentations that we all get. So with that, I'm going to have Jevin come up and he'll take us through his presentation. At the end, we will have some time for Q&A. Thank you.
Great. All right, well, thanks so much, Eric. Thanks so much for all staying for this afternoon session. And thanks for the work you do as investors and entrepreneurs. You're doing an important work, and at the University of Washington, I get to interact a lot with the startup world, and I have so much fun seeing that particular world. Today, I want to focus a little bit on my world, where we sell ideas. So academia and research is very similar to the startup world. I've reviewed hundreds and hundreds of papers, proposals, reports, etc. over the years. And over those years, I've been able to pick out some of these common things that root themselves out that do affect credibility a little bit. Not that we're finger pointing at anyone, as Eric has mentioned. We really want to emphasize that we're just trying to create a culture of calling BS. I think one of the best things your friend can do or your fellow investor is to call BS on you. In fact, I have a whole cadre of friends that I call when I need to have them call BS on me before I submit a paper to Nature or before I submit a new proposal to the National Science Foundation. I also sit on boards of startups and have been a part of some startups myself, so I've seen that, and there's a lot of similarities. So many of my examples today are either the anonymized examples that I've received from Eric, but they're really a collection of things that I've seen over the years. Now, I could give you an entire class on this, so it was hard to figure out how to sample. So I'm going to sample through a few of the pitfalls that I see often, most often around statistics, numbers, and a little bit of that nonsense that we see in slides. And I want to just say that one of the most important things I think in education has been, and certainly is today, especially in the world of generative AI, really is about calling rot on bad ideas. We want to save time, and we want to save resources. And I love John Alexander Smith's quote from 1914, that nothing you'll learn while at the university will be more important than just being able to detect rot when a human or machine says those sorts of things. And when I tell students that, I think they can take that in so that if parents think that they should be getting a lot more, if that's all they're getting. But it's actually something really, really good if that's what we give them when they leave. So what I'm going to go through a lot. I may not get through everything because I do want to leave time for some questions, but I'm going to hit all sorts of things. I'm going to hit hype and hyperbole, logical fallacies that I see all the time, talk about statistical authority, where the zombie statistics that you see all the time in slides and in the media. I'll talk about selection bias. I underline selection bias because I could have written an entire book just about that and not just have a chapter devoted to it. I'll talk about causality because you can't get around that. And I'll talk a little bit about anthropomorphic seduction if I have time. All right, just a quick 20-second background about my research. As Eric mentioned, I co-founded with my colleagues the Center for an Informed Public at the University of Washington, and I spend most of my research time in the darker corners of the internet, looking at the ways in which rumors go from one part of the internet to another, and it can give you a pretty dark view of the internet, and that's why I get super excited to talk to entrepreneurs trying to solve some of those problems. And there's a lot of problems online, I can tell you. So we have this center, and we do this kind of work. Most of the work I do is at the population scale, so we look at tens of millions, hundreds of millions of public posts. We look at the ways that these rumors spread. We look at the affordances. We look at the platforms. We look at the human dynamics that spread these kinds of things. But I don't always like to be at the population level. I like to be at the individual level. That's why I love teaching in university. So as Eric mentioned, my colleague Carl Bullsh, who's also a professor at the University of Washington, we have this course. We have a whole bunch of other projects and games that we built over the years to try to bring public attention to just becoming better thinkers as we move through this complicated world. And the world is complicated. We're inundated with information all the time. And the challenge certainly has been over the last 20 years or so that much of it's quantitative, and quantitative information can be useful. Of course, we use that in science all the time, but a lot of it is BS. I mean, this is the only global warming graph you'll ever need to see. It's actually based on real data, but of course it's zoomed out so far that you can't see that 2-degree increase over the last half century. This is the kind of stuff that we see literally every single day. But we're relatively good at spotting BS words. We've been communicating since we were babies, and we're pretty good at that. We're not experts, and even someone like myself who spends a lot of time teaching this and doing research on BS, it turns out that we're always needing practice in detecting it and being able to refute it. But it's the numbers that really, I think, I want us to pay attention to today. It's that kind of information that carries a lot of authority. And that's why 37% of slides will include made-up statistics. So watch out for those. That's my first joke for the day, but it's one I probably overuse, but I change the number depending on the audience. But I have this book that we talk a lot about this, and if I'm going to have a book in a class about BS, I have to give you examples. And I'll give you my favorite example. I talk about this in the book, and I have my other favorite examples I didn't put in the book. But this is really what I mean. Really, this is our definition that's changing, that it involves language intended to impress, overwhelm, or persuade with a disregard for truth and logical coherence, which is different than a lie. So a liar knows the truth and is pushing you away from the truth, whereas a bullshitter doesn't really necessarily care about the truth one way or the other. So a great example comes from Sigmund Freud. In his notes, he was talking to his lover at the time. This is a real thing, it's not BS, this is real. So I gave my lecture yesterday, despite a lack of preparation. I spoke quite well and without hesitation, which I ascribed to the cocaine I had taken beforehand. I told about my discoveries in brain anatomy, all very difficult things that the audience certainly didn't understand, but all that matters is that they get the impression that I understand it. To me, that's canonical bullshit. And it's something that we have to be aware of as sort of investors of ideas in academia, and I know that investors here have to be aware of that. And even as CEOs and founders of companies, you need to be aware of that too. And by the way, we all bullshit all the time. When we talk about being carbon neutral, I talk to students about being bullshit neutral. We're all bullshitting all the time. We need to somehow even that out by calling it out when we can. All right, so bullshit does involve these things, but it also involves data graphics, statistical figures, and other forms of presentation. And I'm just going to give some old examples, and I'll get to some new examples. But since this was about trust, I think it's like the perfect thing. So the Québécois, as you know, probably in Canada, have had tension with the rest of the Canada for a long time. And you'll see these graphs showing the differences in trust between the people in Quebec and the people in the rest of Canada. But of course, there's something manipulative going on here. If you allow me to manipulate the x-axis like they have, I can make any difference look massively different. And if you replotted this, of course, it's a much different story. And with bar plots, these are simple. We see these plots all the time, of course, in pitch decks and in proposals to the National Science Foundation, which I sit on many of these committees. And so these kinds of things get credibility that Eric was talking about. You don't want to make those mistakes. It's just why, like, of course, is it truncating the y-axis misleading? Of course not. Yes, you get about 50% there. You see the point that's being made with it starting at 98. But we see this, of course, in the real world. We see this at a lot of these big tech events. I remember Tim Cook, when he had taken over, he was showing this cumulative plot, this great story of iPhone sales. But as I always tell my students, cumulative plots always go up. And I see them used so smartly, I guess, to tell stories. Of course, the story he didn't want to show was that the quarterly sales were not quite what they were at the time. But we see this, of course, coming out of our governments all the time. I'll show one example from the left and the right, just to even things out. This is the only political examples I'll show. But in the first Trump administration, they always kept showing these cumulative plots of how well they were doing around testing. But cumulative plots always go up, and it would be a much different story if you looked at those sort of quarterly results. But we also see this, of course, in the Biden administration. We saw other kinds of manipulation on graphs that came out. We pull them from everywhere, and we have lots of these examples. So here you're looking at America's economic growth, and you see what you're supposed to see, of course, is this incredibly big increase here, and you see this in pitch decks a lot of times too. But what you need to be paying attention to was this strange uplift in the y-axis to the left. And they didn't have to even do that. There was still a big growth in 2021, and of course there's context and questions you should be asking as an investor of ideas. But this is the kind of thing that happens all the time. But we also see this when it comes to maps that sort of are trying to tell a story, to sell a story. In this case, there was a big debate about whether there should be closures in the state of Georgia. And if you looked at these two heat maps, they look nearly identical. But there's something problematic with this one. What's the problem here? Yeah, the scale and ranges for the bins are different. And if you do that, you can, again, make it seem like they're almost identical and there's no change going on. Now, in this case, we called them out, and others have called them out too. And to their defense, they said that the software was automatically scaling. So this gets to an important point. It's not just on the consumptive side of information and data information we got to be paying attention to. It's on the production side too. So they had put out these data graphics, allowed the software to do the work. We're allowing AI to do a lot of the work, and they were the ones that had to field the critique. And this also brings up another important point, not just that we need to be watching on the production side of our slides, but also, of course, on the consumption side, but that Hanlon's razor is something to always remember in this new world, that never ascribe to malice what could be adequately explained by competence, but never ascribe to incompetence what could be understandable mistake. So when you go to a pitch session, I think we have to have Hanlon's razor in our mind, that it's not always malice. In fact, I think it's very rarely malice. A lot of times it's truly understandable mistake. And if we have that attitude, we can create this culture of an investing culture that doesn't waste any of our time and resources. Now, I have so many other kinds of data graphics to show, but I have to mention Venn diagrams because I have so many pitches and Venn diagrams. And you would think something so simple as a Venn diagram wouldn't be misused or abused. They are. I'll just show one just to make a point. By a major company in Canada, because I was recently there. This is Thomson Reuters and their use of Venn diagrams. You don't want to have this up in your pitch deck. Trust, partnership, innovation, performance, and their values here. So make sure, if you're going to put up a Venn diagram, please make sure you put up a Venn diagram that actually makes sense. Now, as I mentioned, there's lots of nonsense out there, and a lot of times it's driven by numbers nowadays. And again, there's reason for doing that. Numbers and quantitative assessment, it builds our argument, and of course science, and where I've been trained in science and research, we do depend on them, but we've given them too much authority, the data themselves. So I wanted to pick a local example. Some of you are in the healthcare industry, and I see this in pitch decks where we have these equations. I call it mathiness, which is a form of bullshitting. This is the VMMC equation. Some of you may know it. It's from the Virginia Mason Medical Center, and it actually gets national attention. Books and papers and everything have been written about this VMC quality equation. And by putting up an equation, you almost get this algebraic shock and awe. Wow, that must be official. It's got this algebra and this equation that must be used. And I even show here what these different terms mean. But one of the questions we should always ask if you see an equation show up in a presentation, ask about the units. Whoa, let's not go on. Ask about the units. So in this question, what are the units? The units of outcomes and service have to be the same to add them. We know this from unit conversions in physics. So quality, for some reason, has to be in the units of appropriateness divided by waste times, whatever. And the real problem here is that why this equation when you could have q equals sx, q plus 2, you could have parenthetical plus times x minus double. You could even do square roots of this. So why that? So one of the questions you should ask if you see an equation on a pitch deck, because it gives you that allure of algebraic prowess, you should ask, what are the units, and what are other instantiations of that equation? These are simple questions you can ask. But really what all they're really saying is that there's this parameter of appropriateness that if you increase these, then you decrease these. And if you're honest with your investors, I think that's what you want to get across. You don't need to bullshit them in many ways. And of course we see this all over. I won't go into this, but I like this one because it trust again. Trust is credibility plus reliability plus authenticity divided by perception of self. I mean, it sounds right, but again, ask about the units. All right, so numbers are nonsense. Be on the lookout for mathiness and other forms of algebraic shock and awe is one thing. Now let's move to hype. Hype's interesting. So we study information and influence dynamics online. And we have been for many, many years. And this is an interesting topic all by itself. I could lecture just about hype and hyperbole. Because there are times actually when you want to ride the hype train, but you can also get lost and lose a lot of money if you run the hype train too much. I picked this one because I've been tracking this for a long time, and the news on this just came out yesterday on this. There was a bacterium that was discovered in a very alkaline lake in California. And it was discovered by some NASA researchers that they think they had discovered that arsenic could be used instead of phosphorus, and it could actually be used in their DNA. And it led to all sorts of hype-like media around this. So, wow, we found a new form of life. It makes us rethink all of life. It just led to all sorts of meetings and conferences, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, long story short, this paper just recently got retracted, just within the last few days. It was reported on just yesterday by the scientists. And there's been some debate about whether it should be retracted, because the scientists didn't do anything wrong. I mean, there was just some contamination likely in this. This was published in Science, by the way, the top scientific journal of all time. But I bring this example because the hype that grew from something that had a very weak foundation, and I always say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And this particular example just didn't remember that, even though it did get through science. And again, there was nothing nefarious that anyone's been able to pull up around these NASA researchers. I just think it's part of how we do science and how we do, the startup world. You try ideas, and sometimes you have some random collisions of ideas and opportunities, and then you find out later that it just doesn't hold. But the hype that grew from that was wasteful in many ways, in that it led to a whole bunch of other projects that if we would have just dug a little bit deeper on the methodologies, that would have been helpful. Now we've seen that, of course, in the AI world all the time and every day, and even in science, we've seen this huge rise in AI replacing much of what we do in science. In fact, there's this paper out of Sakana AI that claims that they can just do all of science, from hypothesis to writing to peer review to analysis, etc. And of course, the hype around that has distracted us from some of the really good investments in AI when it comes to improving and facilitating and speeding science up. But I just, the reason why I kind of pause with hype is that hype, though, can be used to garner people's attention in good ways. You just have to be extra careful if you start to feel that hype wave. And there's a whole bunch of work that I have colleagues around the country that have studied this, and again, when it comes to influence dynamics. So just be on the lookout for hype and hyperbole. Now, logical fallacies. This is a favorite of mine. I would love to go through a dozen or so logical fallacies. I chose one because of some examples that Eric sent me. And this is one that I see in my work all the time that comes across my desk. So I've taken the examples that I've seen, and I've created a fake example. This is fictitious problem statement. In this case, imagine this is one of the slides in the pitch deck. It reduced transportation costs. That's the problem statement. And let's say, like in 2022, the United States told, this is all not true information. This is just made up. Total national transportation expenditures reached 2.7 trillion, with road repairs accounting for 37% of that total amount. So your problem statement is you're going to reduce transportation costs, and that's your claim. So does anyone know what might be missing here with this particular statement as you look at this? Yes?
Total U.S. expenditures.
Okay, so that's one thing. That's good. What else?
They're clearly not spending 37% on road repair.
Yes, okay, good. You should be asking, like, what's what we call the plausibility test. So that's good. Yes?
When you say it reached 2.7, is that for the year of 2023 or current year's up to 2023?
I want to invest in you guys. You guys are asking all the right questions. This is good. You're hitting all the ones I say. Okay, keep going. There's about 4 or 5 other things I want to pull out. Yes?
What is transportation?
Yeah, what is transportation? This is, you guys got to come to my classes so the students get to learn how quickly to ask these kinds of questions. Yes?
Which United
Which United States?
States?
I have to think about Oh, yes, that's right. That's true. There could be other United States. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Yes?
And the data's not cited.
Yes. That's one thing, and it's interesting, it wasn't, it's certainly a norm within science that we have to put citations. I think it has been, and you can verify that, the investors want to see those references because they want to check, especially in a world with fake citations and what I call hallucitations. There's the hallucinations and there's hallucitations out there, and that's the telltale sign when I know that a student actually just used AI to write their pitch decks or write their stories for their ideas, so that's good. Anything else? What else? A key thing that I think is missing in a lot of these as well is a disconnect between some sort of big number, big statement, and the business case. So if the business case was to reduce the costs, it's important to actually provide information. I didn't provide you the rest of the slide deck, but there's typically what's missing here. Oh, sorry, the font, everything's kind of a little messed up here. One of the big ones that I see is non sequiturs. Often, there is a disconnect between some big number that you have found in some fact sheet or some paper, and it just doesn't connect to the business case. And it's something that I see often in proposals to the NIH and the NSF, that there is a big statement about the cost or the loss of money, but there's not a connection between that and the case that's being made for the investment. Now, another thing that I see often are these zombie statistics. How often do we say, oh, 10% brain utilization? I see this all the time. It's one of these, infinite number of statistics that somehow survive into our vernacular all the time. And then they're used to make a case, either a business case or a case, again, proposals to the government for things. And sometimes they even have, fake connection, not fake, but very tenuous connections to even the literature, maybe sometimes legitimate literature and sometimes predatory literature. But these zombie statistics are things that we need to call out as soon as possible and kill them. The 10% brain utilization is a very common one. But there are others that other kinds of numbers that exist out there. This is from a pitch deck where the claim here was that there was 75% of adults in the US suffer from chronic dehydration. And from that claim, this is the pitch point onto the request for funding and for the business model. So what's wrong with this? What would you call out? If you saw this, what are some questions you might ask? Yes?
Occasionally, what frequency is this?
Frequency, yes, exactly. Frequency, and then I won't put the words in the mouth for the next one. Frequency or sorry, you might have something else. Yes?
Similar, like when and where, basically like how often and what time, and 75 is that add up, or what day is that?
Right, this frequency, and the other thing I was going to just say, just not to put words in words, is just degree too, about how thirsty are you? Just a little bit, not too much? Yes?
What is chronic dehydration? Is that even a thing?
Right, because chronic has a real word with it. Yes.
It's made up.
Exactly, I love it. Yes?
It doesn't have any impact. Like dehydration in small amounts probably doesn't have that much of an impact.
Right, when Eric and I were talking about this, one thing that came to my mind is we're always a little tired, but if you're just a little bit tired, it's not gonna stop us at least from walking down the street or maybe even driving a car if we're a little, but yeah, exactly, what's the effects, what's the impact of that, yes?
Method of measurement?
Yeah, how do you measure this sort of thing? Who's measuring and where did this number come from? What are the methodologies to establish such a, big number? I mean, look at it, it's even written really big, big, 75, it's very intimidating, yes.
Always question numbers like 25, 50, 75.
Yeah, yes, right, exactly. That's another thing. I like it's a clever way of pointing out these little subtleties that I like. Yes.
Policy, which group, age.
Yeah. Which is this for the whole population? Is it for different parts of the demographics would be something that would be highly relevant. Yes.
So I just Googled it.
Yes.
And
Oh, all right. Let's see what you're
this is a plus for AI, right? Because now it's an AI answer, and it
Yeah.
says, well, mainstream media publishes 75%. Here's the problems with that. It breaks it all down with, yeah, it's really cool.
Okay, so I'm usually I'm more on the critical side of AI's snippets on Gemini, with Gemini and other places, but I will say I applaud that. That's good, even if
It's
it's
not good for your job retention.
No. Exactly. Excellent. Yes, Brenda.
The way they teach us in class, I'm a student, the way they teach us in class, they tell us to use data to tell a story, right? So I know by looking at that 75%, I was told if you want to tell a certain story, just throw in a big number.
Just throw a big and make it big too. The font has
Yes,
to be big, right?
exactly. Tell us.
Exactly.
So I can use data to make to tell whatever story I would like
Exactly.
to tell. So that's
Exactly.
just something I was
No,
thinking about.
exactly, and that's the whole point of at least mostly this session, but just an overall theme that exists in the work that we do on the teaching, the pedagogical side, and of course even on our research when we're looking at the ways that we were spread. And when there's emotion or there's numbers, those things can just amplify statements and thoughts really, really fast. All right, statistical authority. Sorry for the formatting, I had to compress it to a PDF. The idea here is to look out for zombie statistics, decontextualized numbers, degreeless conclusions, these kinds of things. Now, here's one of my favorite. Selection bias is something we've probably heard of, but I'm going to push you a little bit and give you a few things that I've been seeing over and over. And I don't expect you to hear some of these concepts, but I just take this next few as sort of more advanced level, a little bit harder to follow, but I want to try it out today. So selection bias occurs when people that you're trying to sample, or whatever you're trying to sample, differ systematically from the population, and that can have consequences. So my kids actually taught me this one, so it's a puzzle from the industry. So for whatever reason, my kids, when they're listening to a Mariners game, whatever, they always hear in the commercials, switching saves you $500 on average from Progressive, it saves you $498 from Allstate, it saves you $502 from Farmers, Geico saves you $500. How is it that every insurance company can save you $500 from its competitor? If they're all saving you $500, we've got a strange equilibrium going on here, right? So why is it? Why would you save $500? What explains this?
It could be a temporary discount.
Okay, it could be a temporary discount. So it could be legitimate. It could not be true. But let's even assume that it's true. Then it might be a temporary discount. What else?
Be sure to pick their plans.
Yeah, they could have exactly. They could have.
So if you didn't switch, don't say $500. If you did switch.
You got it. So that's the real selection bias issue there. That those that end up switching, that's basically the number that we're willing on average to go through the pain of like finding a new agent, filling out the stupid forms, like clearing out the file folder of the last company. It's about the cost of the $500. But what they're looking at are the ones that switch, not the ones that don't switch. A lot of the don't switches didn't switch because they didn't do it for $30 or whatever. So that's the key point, is the selection bias. So that's good. And so one of the things that I see when it comes to selection bias, it comes in lots of different flavors. And there's all sorts of really interesting work in healthcare that deals with the tools for detecting things like cancer early. And these are good I don't want to, as I go through this example, to say that those techniques don't work, because they do, but we have to be careful of what the null hypothesis is when it comes to early detection. And we've been hearing this for many, many years, from the 1970s forward, about the effects of early cancer screening. And the main hypothesis here is that if you can diagnose cancer early, you'll save lives, right? And again, there is evidence of this, but I want to show you a scenario that has to do with selection bias that gives you a different result. And so by going through this exercise, and there are lots of companies that have made their money on things like this, both legitimate and sometimes not legitimate, because they weren't paying attention to some of this selection bias. And the thing that you can be thinking about when you see these examples is something called changing group composition. It's a form of selection bias. And the way of identifying this actually comes from this wonderful paper written in the 1980s called the Will Rogers phenomenon. And this paper sort of showed how you can get these misleading statistics about early detection methods. And Will Rogers himself was this character who was a vaudeville performer, comedian, actor, he did everything, but he was kind of really well known for his pithy little quotes. He said, when the Okies left Oklahoma and moved to California, they raised the average intelligence level in both states. How could that be? Well, what it means, of course, is that, and explains this changing group composition that I'm going to show you, that those that were not the smartest in Oklahoma were smarter than the smartest in California, right? All right, so that's what's going on here, potentially, at least with the hypothetical of nothing actually changing on metastatic cancer conditions and localized cancer conditions. So let's imagine this is all kind of made up, this is made up data, and you have on the left those that have localized versions of a particular cancer. Those on the right have less time to live, that's metastatic. And the idea with the technology is that with early technology, you're actually going to shift those in the early detection technology over to the metastatic. And by doing that, then you take averages of these individual groups and you report success. So did you notice the average would go up for the blue, or whatever that color is, it's got a different color on the screen. The average would go up for both sides, and you would report success to the community, and you report success to your investors and to your customers, which are the hospitals. You say that, look, we did early detection, we can look at both groups, and the average lifespan goes up on both groups. So the average lifespan increases from 2 to 3 in the cancer group, the average lifespan increases from 6 to 7 in the precancerous group. So the average lifespan increases from both of these, but the overall life expectancy hasn't changed at all. Now I see this quite often, and it's, again, there are many, many flavors of selection bias. This one's a little more complicated, but it's one I'm starting to see more often. So again, the best thing you can do if you see a pitch deck, that has group composition issues, and that's where you've shown success, then you should be asking questions about those groups. So in this case, both groups improve, but the aggregate doesn't. How sicker groups improve, but also get larger. Healthier groups improve, but also get smaller. Now another selection bias favorite of mine, some of you have probably heard of Simpson's paradox. It became famous because of a faculty member at Berkeley at the time named Simpson, who identified, was able to explain a really strange story about admissions for men and women at the time, and it was all about changing group composition. But let me give you a recent example that are about penguins. My kids love penguins, and so I wanted to find an example with penguins. And these penguins, which are just fine south of Chile, have been studied for a very long time, and there's data that's reported like there is on any research project or on any company that's showing the efficacy of their results. And I can't tell you how many times that I see a graph that looks like this, a whole bunch of dots, let's just say, and even the distribution shown, and you see a downward trend. So what does your eye do? It looks at the downward trend, you say, wow, look at that effect, that's worth investing in. But one of the questions you should be asking is, are there groups inherent within that data? Because this, at least with this data that I found with the penguin data, if we're just looking at something very simple, this isn't anything to do with any new technology, this is just to illustrate a point about group composition. If you look at the colon depth and the colon length, it looks like it's going down overall, but if you break it by the 3 different types of penguins that I showed, you get a very different result. That is dramatically different, and this has had implications that I didn't want to call any individual companies that have faltered for this, and also research proposals and papers that have gone through peer review that I caught, or many of my colleagues have caught, that have real severe effects on the conclusion. So again, you should be asking about group composition. Let me give you one more example of selection bias, and I'll move to the other, the last few here. So there's a huge business out there for wellness programs. I've seen them at the university for a long time. And the question, of course, is do they work? Because I've seen tons of pitches on these, for sure. And here, the point is that if you can invoke these wellness company or these wellness programs, they can then show to the investors that they are working, and to the clients, in this case universities and large organizations, that they're working. But there was a really interesting question to be asked on the selection bias side, is who was asked to participate? This is a selection bias issue. So employees who would participate, the claim is have lower medical costs and miss fewer days of work. And this is actually true. They're not lying about the data. This is true, and then this is what's sold in this really large industry. The problem is there's serious selection bias issues, that employees who participate likely differ systematically from those who do not. In particular, they may be healthier. So if I'm healthier, and there's a program for me to get a gym membership and other things and get healthier food for less cost or whatever it is, I'm gonna participate. But if you're not as healthy, maybe you don't want to participate because of the requirements of going to the gym or whatever it is. So there was this University of Illinois study that revealed this really clearly, and it's really a great model for the kinds of assessments we should do when there are claims where there likely is convenient sampling or selection bias. So here, what this program did, this was different. This is what really revealed the selection bias, is that they didn't just look at those that were offered the program. Some choose to participate, some choose not to participate. They needed to also look at who were not offered the program and weren't able to participate in a random way, so you could get it a random control trial. And if you looked at the results, what's interesting, sorry, you can't see it quite as well, but the point here is that this was the slide that was given, essentially, to a large degree, to a lot of the clients, showing massive differences. So they're saying, here, they did this observational comparison. Those that are participating in running events went up, higher than no effect. Number of gym visits went up. You saw ends of employment less, hospital spending less, et cetera, et cetera. And then they added this element, this random control element, which was offered to people that were not able to participate in a random way. And what they found, lo and behold, was it was zero effect on everything. Now, that was just a simple question that you could ask during the pitch now of how did they sample the population. It doesn't require a PhD in statistics or computer science or any of the programs that we have at the university. You can simply ask, how was it sampled and what were the methods for doing the assessment. And so this is just driving home the point that you really want to be on the lookout for changing group compositions, left censoring, which I didn't talk about, and right censoring, and convenient sampling. All right, so there's a lot of investment in the medical community, and you hear this, I see this in the news as we study these things online. This is the random medical news that we seem to get all the time, because I like wine and other things, and it's wine, one day can cause, improved stamina, and then the next day it's heart disease, and then it's is that thing with children, or that, this is the sort of rotating, and no wonder sometimes medical community or the public can get sort of a little distrustful of what's going out in medical community. But that's just how science works, but also as investors we want to be aware of at least the sort of galaxy of results around certain kinds of claims. And so I'm just going to pick one that you can use to call out things, and that's the peril of outcome switching. A little more complicated, but this is just a fictitious example, but this is typically what happens in nature news or any big news, or also in startup news areas. You have some sort of result, novel therapeutic compound for treatment of geriatric seizures. And you look at that, and I always tell my students, go straight to the results and go straight to the methods, then go to the results. Because if you just go to the results, this is maybe something you would see here. And you would notice here that there is a difference between the control and the treatment for this equilogen treatment, where you see a difference when taking the treatment and those not. But there was something that happened with this particular hypothetical example. And I say hypothetical because we see this all the time. I'm writing a whole education unit for the National Institute of Health so that our future biomedical researchers don't run into this problem. What happened in this case, it's not that anything here is wrong, but what happened was that they switched the outcome halfway through the experiment. They found that they didn't see much of a result with the overall population that they had, which was beyond the age length that you see here, from 56 to 70. And what they did in this particular example is that they then switched to subsets of the group where there was an effect. Now, there might have been a real effect of this particular drug on that older set of individuals, but you can't do that and then claim that it's effective. The original data looked like this. No effect. That was ages 20 to 70. But if you go back to this one, you see it's 56 to 70. That's called outcome switching. I see it all the time. It's such an issue. That's why I'm writing this big new education unit for the NIH, because we see it so often. Now, there's a whole bunch of these things we call QRPs, questionable research practices, that also exist when making cases for startup companies. So the main thing here is scientific rigor. You need to be looking for outcome switching. I don't have time to talk about p-hacking and many of the other QRPs, but I just wanted to whet your appetite for things to look out for. Now, another thing that we talk a lot about to our students is that you don't need to know all the details of the black box. You don't need to know the machine learning details, the statistical procedures. You simply need to ask questions, most often, of the data and the output, and sometimes the interpretation of that output. And you will catch like 80 to 90%, probably, just from my own anecdotal experience, reviewing hundreds and hundreds of papers over the years, that almost very rarely is it a problem with the black box procedure. It has to do with the data sampling and the output interpretation. So let's use an example that was that got a lot of AI attention during COVID. There were several results and many companies that were forming that were claiming that they could use AI to detect pneumonia. And the claim was that the AI was likely seeing patterns that radiologists couldn't see. Now, that doesn't mean that AI shouldn't be used hand in hand with radiologists. There's lots of work still being done on that. I don't want to make a claim that it doesn't work, but at least the claims that were being made is something really important. Basically, well, I'll go to what the claim is first, that there are system features within a radiograph that indicate disease. There's image features, and for some reason, radiologists can't see them, but AI supposedly can. And if you look at the disease state, the main claim is that the disease state leads to these image features, which would then allow this diagnostic potential with AI. And so the question is this a breakthrough? And really at this point, we want to be asking the right questions, and I just love the fact you guys are all asking really good questions of those pitch examples, just because that's exactly what I tell students to do. Just start asking questions. And long story short, it had nothing to do with any sort of, complex set of patterns within the radiograph that told you something about the etiology of the disease. It had everything to do with the hospital and with whether it was a supine position in which it was taken or not. And the AI was smart in picking those out, but that's important when doing these kinds of interrogations of what a technology can and can't do. It was looking, for example, whether it was supine or portable. So if someone had to take it in an outpatient, they would have a different end result. So it was predicting those things on features that have nothing to do with the etiology disease. So one of the things that we do is we do a lot of these causal diagrams. If we had time, I'd go through this exercise when we write causal diagrams for claims and pitches or in proposals, and then we can set these up and we can look for these different common causes that are leading to these things. So the point here is to focus on the data and the output rather than just the output. Okay. All right, so that leads to almost my last section on causality. Causality, everyone hears this, and the students always nod their head when I say, okay, we're gonna talk about causality. They're like, I know, Jevin, it's, correlation doesn't imply causality. And I say, that's right, now let's do some tests. And they typically struggle. And it's not just students that struggle, we all struggle because we're not really built for this. And we have these cognitive biases that lead us to be many times not as skilled as we want to when it comes to causality. And the point I want to make here is that researchers make those mistakes too. If you look at this study that looked at the 50 most shared research studies about health outcomes, half of them are articles. These are science writers. Misattributed causality. On the 50 most shared, even worse, a third of the journal articles themselves, so this is the researchers themselves, misattributed causality. So the point here is causality is not easy, and that's why we do these diagram exercises. And so there are all sorts of examples from COVID that I like to use. This is one of the favorite because I can track how viral these things went. This one went incredibly viral. The claim here was that bald men were at high risk of severe coronavirus symptoms, and they had a real paper to support this. There was already some ideas about companies being formed about, addressing this because of this issue. What could they do? What were the pathways leading to this, et cetera, et cetera. And then all of a sudden it came crashing down really fast. Yes?
What is the data age-wise?
You got it. You're a step ahead of me. Yes. So yes, you are correct. So that was the hypothesis that it was endocrine activity, but instead age was the common side. And so Forbes and all these journals had to retract because they had missed this really important common cause, which you just identified. So that's the whole point here, is that we need to be on the lookout for these common causes or alter causes, and also all sorts of other things with causality. So this is the big thing we're looking out for. So we want to be on the lookout for correlation conflation. But by the way, correlation doesn't mean it doesn't link to causality. You could still have correlation and causality. There's a real causal story. It just means that you can't assume that. But also to be on the lookout for reverse causality, common cause, et cetera, et cetera. This whole, I can give the entire 10 lectures just on causality. It's one of my favorite as well. All right, so I'm going to wrap up now by just saying a few things about AI and how that's affecting the way that we're seeing pitches and how we're seeing people communicate in the research of ideas world. So we have a new course called Modern Day Oracles or Bullshit Machines. It's all free. You can go, any of the things that we put up are free because we're a university. But like many of our fields, generative AI is sort of taking over, meant much of science. And we're making all sorts of mistakes. So what you're looking at here are 2 papers that were published in Elsevier. It's the largest publisher in the world. And you'll see in the introduction, certainly, here's a possible introduction for your topic. Or even better was this other paper. I'm very sorry, I don't have access to real-time information or patient-specific data, as I'm an AI language model. Somehow this got through peer review, and this doesn't mean science is broken. It just, we're going through some growing pains when it comes to AI. And I don't want us to go through some growing pains as much in the startup world because it's a waste of a lot of money and time. Now, this has been called out, and we've seen this in many different ways. But even worse than this, I was recently an expert witness in the state of Minnesota around synthetic media. I was one of the witnesses, and a Stanford professor was the other one. I won't call him out because everyone makes these kinds of mistakes. He's an expert in misinformation, and when they got his declaration, they found a lot of fake citations. Long story short, he used ChatGPT to write his expert testimony that he signed was his words. So we don't want to affect our credibility as investors or as CEOs of new companies and founders. So this is a lesson just to be careful. And people make these mistakes, but what a mistake this particular one was. Yes?
So AI is in our lives, right? At what point does it become maybe over-dependence on it, or should we not use it at all in writing? How to be?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. It's a very complicated, and I go through this. So I have this dialectical approach to this whole AI thing. One day I wake up and I think it is truly the most amazing tool that we've ever seen. And then the next day I wake up and I think they're just great BSers. And they are. They're excellent BSers. So it's in between, I think, and I try to take that fine line. This is just a very simple course where I'm writing a bunch of things on it and I can go into details. But the quick answer for that is there are times that they're absolutely going to use and we can't ignore it. And we use it, it's transforming education and research. And I think all of our world, but there's certain things we have to be careful. So if we have time, I'll talk about it more if we want to talk about that. But like I said, it creates all sorts of loose citations. Of course, we have to be on the lookout. And also, the citations themselves are post hoc. So if you look at references and you find fake references in a pitch deck, you know that that's likely AI generated. I won't talk about the search as much. I'll just say that this was just a recent, fairly recent. This was just last year. How many presidents did the University of Washington have? I just asked this. 4 U.S. presidents graduated from the University of Washington. And of course, these kinds of things are being fixed. But I put that out because it can't get, we've been talking about numbers and data. The part that I have a lot of fun making fun of AI is with numbers still. So how is the 75th percentile lower than the average annually for these are the kind of numbers. And even better, when I ask it about different jobs out there and salary for things like a bullshit salary or a modern day Oracle salary, it looks like you can't make as much calling bullshit. So this is a real screenshot, by the way, of AI giving the answers. I guess the point here is that we have to be careful about what we can, when we do our searches and our due diligence for our companies that we're investing in, that we can't just rely on AI, and I have an infinite number of examples of these kinds of things. I'll skip this part by just saying that we have put too much attention on AI's cognitive ability and less on its communicative ability. So I have a paper that was recently published in the National Academy of Science where I argue that we need to be looking at the benefits and dangers of this anthropomorphic seduction that we have with this particular technology and its relationship to the Turing test. I will go into that by just saying this. As in any fairy tale, accepting magical assistance comes with risks. So watch out for that. There's a little bit about seduction. So I went through a whole bunch of stuff. Sorry, I went through really fast. This was just a sampling. But I just want to end with one of the earliest writers of critical thinking. And critical thinking is so important in this world. It's so important in the world of ideas, which is both in academia and in the startup world. And I think one of the best things we can do in this world where AI has infused almost everything that we do, we need to be thinking about this as an opportunity to really identify what we're special at as humans. And of course, we have our human experience with us, but also our ability to refine our thinking, our critical thinking. And importantly, when we do this work, critical thinking is more than just an individual activity, it's a social activity. So hopefully we can build a culture in Seattle that is open to critiquing each other in healthy ways that keeps into account Hammond's razor and other things. So with that, I'll end and we can open the discussion.
Okay, we'll take some questions.
Thank you for your presentation. Should we also be asking about the self-interest, motivation, and goals of the presenters, in addition to questioning the methodology?
I totally agree. And actually, I would even turn the question on you. I'm curious why you're asking this, because it's coincidentally, we were just talking about how, because of these cognitive biases that we have, once you know the motivations, that can add that context you need for either finding errors or just understanding better where a story is being told. But I absolutely think we should be asking those questions. I'm curious, why would you want to ask those questions? Because we were just having this discussion at a conference recently.
I got your mental
You're good. You're good. That's why you did it. That's even better. The reason why motivations are important when we study disinformation and misinformation is that and I heard you guys talking a little bit about it. So disinformation has this intentional element. It's harder to detect. It usually has strategic intent and has multiple stakeholders. Misinformation is things that can be done by accident. But when you throw in human agency into those equations, then it adds a different element that makes us ask different questions.
So I would recommend How Spies Think.
Oh, interesting. I don't know about this. I'll check it out. How Spies Think.
Yeah. So he was in British intelligence for 20
that's
years.
so interesting.
Doing the analysis and creating the reports for the diplomatic corps to negotiate. And after 20 years, he went over to the diplomatic corps as a customer, negotiating deals and issues that might affect the country.
That is amazing.
Or the fate of your business.
I will be ordering this book from my local bookstore right after this. How Spies Think is at the end of it. Okay, thank you for the recommendation. I appreciate it. I'm always looking for that stuff. Excellent.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm in the business of science communication, and I wrestle with a lot of that all the time because you want people to understand,
Yes.
and you want people to pay attention. So how do you do that ethically while still being scientifically accurate, knowing that a lot of people don't have scientific literacy?
It's such a good question, and it's so hard to do. I tend to think that most people do have good intentions and want to communicate in ways that are fair and representative of whatever they're trying to tell. There is, of course, a subset of the population that will be a little more nefarious and trying to pull the wool over our eyes. In that case, I think that it just comes from practice. I think one of the things that when we're trying to communicate our results, we need to be telling it in different ways, because as we've learned in the education world, everyone is taking things in differently, not just because they have different contexts and experiences, but because they may have different modalities of learning as well. And so I think we need to think about it when we talk to the public and when we're talking to an investor. If you're trying to sell an idea, don't, come prepared by being ready to tell the story in multiple different ways. And in terms of being respectful and ethical to the true story that you think underlies it, I think just some of the basics of referencing as much as you can, showing like when I'm asking questions, when I see an analysis, I ask to get, I want to get as close to the data as I can. How was the data collected? I don't want to just see a result. I want to see how was it collected, what were some of the challenges that you had, just asking questions and interrogating in ways that you would if you were like a Wikipedian. You're just sort of, just trying to figure out, like, how is it that you got to that data? So I think we can do this back and forth by having healthy interrogation and not taking offense to that as well. One of the things I really, really want to emphasize at the end of the class that I teach, at the end of the semester that I teach once a year, is I emphasize that calling BS isn't about making you look smarter, it's about making everyone smarter. So if you're the person, the well-actually guy that's sitting at the Thanksgiving dinner table, well, actually, we don't want that. That's not the calling. Calling BS is like saying it in a way that everyone gets smarter. And if we can keep that in mind, then if that's your motivation, speaking of motivations, then I think we tend to do a better job of revealing as much as we can to get to that truth there as well. But it's a really hard one.
Hi, thanks so much.
Yes.
So I'm Ben, I'm a founder. I'm overjoyed I didn't see any data from my deck.
Okay.
It was,
Well, we may have had an average to show, but yeah.
but that kind of brings me, or it was really well blinded. Thank you, it was. How do we avoid, as people putting these things together that are so involved with our project or our venture, how do we not pull the wool over our own eyes when we're putting these together? Because I think a lot of this is well-intentioned, but
Yes.
totally done by us.
That's the majority. I truly think the mistakes that we've seen are almost always with good intentions. That's why I always bring up Hammond's razor as much as I can, because I do think it's honest mistake. And the way that we do it, at least in my lab and in our department, is that we've built this culture around the phone call saying, hey, I'm ready to push this out. Could you just spend 10 minutes, look at this, poke holes at it? And if you sort of thank them for calling bullshit on it. It's not, there's people that study this, it's really interesting. There's different cultures that have either, integrated this more into the everyday life and some that's hard to do. But I think if you can create that in your company, I invite that. Please do. In fact, there's been some great studies in the airline industry with, so some of you have read probably about the Korean Airlines. In surgical rooms, we've talked to surgeons how they have to create that culture. You can't, yes, you have the person with the most experience, but you want people to be able to question authority. And you may not like it as the founder, someone like, well, what do you know what you're talking about, sort of thing. But you want to create that in a way that's healthy. And I have a network of expert friends that I can then call up. And I invite it, and then I give it back to them. But I do it in a courteous way, and we try to do it with a smile on our face too. So, yeah.
I'm curious, what types of organizations and stakeholders have been most invested in your work. So I'm in corporate, but I have a lot of friends in Silicon Valley, and they share with me that in that world, there are folks for whom the work that you do is a painkiller, right? But others for whom it may be misaligned with their incentives. And so you mentioned some stakeholders and organizations in healthcare that are sponsoring your work. I'm curious, who else has been really invested in the champion work you do?
Yeah, so we get about 50% of our funding from the federal government, not anymore as much because the federal government has cut big cuts into federal research funding, and then the other half from private. And most of our private comes from the Knight Foundation initially. So the Knight Foundation is out of Florida. It was from the Knight family. And they fund community organizations. We were some of the first research that they ever did. We've had some funding, a little bit from Microsoft. We've had funding from organizations that are interested specifically, say, in health misinformation versus other kinds of information like political misinformation. I'm a little less involved that my colleagues are, which as you can imagine would be very, very sticky and leads to all sorts of challenges and FOIA requests and lawsuits and everything. So that's definitely challenging. It's hard. There's a lot of places we could not get accepted money because we have to be able to critique too in ways. It's very, very challenging to study misinformation because one person's misinformation could be someone else's good information. So one of the things that I've started to do personally with some of my students is we've turned from the content itself and started to study which is simply disagreement. So we study disagreement online now. So we don't care about what it could be about flat earth, it could be about vaccines, it could be about anything. What we do is to study the dynamics of disagreement, how it grows and changes based on different policies and changes in platforms. And so that's helped a little bit step away from some of the really difficult issues when it comes to what's truth and what's not. What epistemology do we consider that? So it's a good question, it's a hard one.
So